Chapter 3. Secret Stanzas. The hidden lake lay like a mirror in the woods, 3 miles outside town where the hiking trail forked and most tourists turned back. Alara had discovered it during one of her restless walks, but she'd never imagined bringing anyone else here, especially not Julian Blackwood, who now sat beside her on the fallen log that served as her makeshift bench, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body in the cool October air. 2 weeks had passed since the Nanuta book appeared under her door, 2 weeks of stolen glances across the street and carefully orchestrated coincidental meetings. They perfected the art of looking like strangers in public while carrying on an entire conversation with her eyes. "Tell me about the doctorate," Alara said, her fingers trailing in the still water. They've been talking for an hour about books, about poetry, about everything except the tension crackling between them like electricity before a storm. Julian was quiet for so long she thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight she hadn't heard before. Columbia University. Comparative literature with a focus on modern American poetry. He picked up a smooth stone and turned it over in his hands. "I was going to be the next great academic mind, publish groundbreaking papers, maybe write the definitive biography of Robert Frost. What happened?" The stone skipped across the water's surface 1, 2, 3 times before disappearing beneath the dark water. "I discovered that academia is more about politics than poetry, that brilliant minds can be destroyed by jealous colleagues, and that sometimes the most passionate scholars are the ones who get eaten alive." There was pain in his voice, old and carefully buried, but Alara could hear it clearly. She'd learned to read the subtle shifts in his tone, the way his shoulders tensed when he was remembering something he'd rather forget. "So you ran away to a small town and opened a bookstore," she said gently. "I prefer to think of it as strategic retreat." A ghost of a smile played at his lips, though I'll admit, some days it feels more like exile. The confession hung in the air between them, vulnerable and honest in a way that made Alara's chest tight. Without thinking, she reached for his hand, their fingers intertwining naturally. "I used to think this place was my exile too," she admitted. "Everyone else from high school left for college or jobs in the city, and here I am, serving coffee and writing poetry nobody reads." "I read your poetry." The simple statement sent heat rushing through her veins. Julian's thumb traced patterns on the back of her hand, such a small touch, but it made her hyper-aware of every point where their bodies were connected. "Julian," she started, but he was already leaning closer, his free hand coming up to cup her face. "We shouldn't be here," he murmured, even as his lips brushed against hers. "This is insane." "I know," she breathed against his mouth. "I don't care." The kiss that followed was different from their desperate encounter in the bookstore. This was slow and thorough, a conversation conducted in sighs and gentle explorations. When Julian's hands tangled in her hair, Allura felt something inside her chest crack open, spilling wanton need and feelings she wasn't ready to name. They broke apart breathing hard, foreheads pressed together, and Alara could see her own desire reflected in his dark eyes. "We can't keep meeting like this," Julian said, his voice rough. "Someone will see us eventually. Then we'll be more careful." She kissed the corner of his mouth, reveling in the way he shuddered at the simple contact. "There are places. I know this town better than most people think." Which was how they found themselves here 3 days later, clothes scattered on the forest floor, Julian's mouth tracing a path down her throat while autumn leaves rustled overhead. The risk of discovery only heightened every sensation, the cool air against her heated skin, the rough bark of the oak tree at her back, the desperate way Julian whispered her name like a prayer. "You're going to be the death of me," he groaned against her collarbone, his hands mapping the curves of her body with reverent precision. "What a way to go," she gasped, arching into his touch. They made love with wild abandon, two people drunk on secrecy and the intoxicating knowledge that what they were doing was supposed to be impossible. Every touch was electric, every kiss a small rebellion against the world that said they didn't belong together. Afterward, they lay tangled together on Julian's jacket, her head on his chest while he traced lazy patterns on her bare shoulder. The late afternoon sun filtered through the canopy above, painting everything in gold and amber. "Tell me about him," Julian said quietly. Alara didn't need to ask who he meant. She'd mentioned her ex-boyfriend only in passing, but Julian had the uncanny ability to read between the lines of everything she said. Derek. The name felt strange on her tongue now. We dated for 2 years, all through the end of high school. Everyone expected us to get married, settle down, maybe take over his family's hardware store. But you didn't want that. I thought I did for a while. It would have been easy, safe, but then I started writing more seriously. Started talking about college or maybe moving to the city. And he? She sighed, pressing her face against Julian's chest. He said I was being ridiculous, that poetry wasn't a real career, that I should be grateful for what I had instead of chasing impossible dreams. Julian's hand stilled on her shoulder. What did you do? I broke up with him 3 months ago. Packed up my apartment, moved into that tiny place above the hardware store, which is ironic, considering, and decided to take a gap year to figure out what I really wanted. And what do you want? The question was loaded with meaning that had nothing to do with her 5-year plan. Alara lifted her head to look at him, struck by how young he looked in the dappled sunlight, the lines of worry and careful control smoothed away by satisfaction and something that might have been happiness. This, she said simply, whatever this is. Julian's expression grew serious. Alara, you need to understand, I can't offer you anything permanent, the age difference alone. She silenced him with a kiss, fierce and demanding. I'm not asking for forever, Julian, I'm asking for now. But even as she said the words, Alara knew they weren't entirely true. What she felt for him was already deeper than anything she'd experienced with Derek, more intense than any of the crushes and casual relationships that had come before. Julian challenged her intellectually, supported her artistically, and made her body sing in ways she hadn't known were possible. The sound of voices on the distant trail made them both freeze. Julian's arm tightened around her protectively as they listened to what sounded like a couple of hikers discussing the best route back to town. The voices grew closer, and for a terrifying moment, Alara was sure they were about to be discovered half-naked in the woods by some well-meaning nature enthusiasts who would undoubtedly recognize the local bookstore owner. They held their breath until the voices faded, then burst into nervous laughter. Christ, Julian muttered, running a hand through his disheveled hair. We really are insane. Completely, Alara agreed, but she was smiling as she reached for her scattered clothes. Same time tomorrow? Julian caught her wrist, pulling her back down for another kiss that tasted like secrets and promises neither of them was ready to make. You're going to give me a heart attack. At least you'll die happy. As they dressed in comfortable silence, Alara caught Julian watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. There was desire there, certainly, but also something that looked dangerously like affection. Maybe even the beginnings of something deeper. The walk back to town was necessarily distant. They couldn't risk being seen together, especially not looking like they'd just spent hours making love in the woods. But even with 20 feet between them on the trail, Alara could feel the invisible thread that connected them, taut with possibility and the delicious tension of shared secrets. When they reached the edge of town, Julian stopped at the corner where their paths would diverge. Alara, he said quietly, glancing around to make sure they were alone. Be careful. If anyone finds out about this. They won't, she said with more confidence than she felt. I'm good at keeping secrets. But as she walked home alone, Alara couldn't shake the feeling that their stolen moments were living on borrowed time. Small towns had long memories and sharp eyes, and what they were doing, a respected businessman carrying on with a teenager barely out of high school, would be the kind of scandal that could destroy everything Julian had built here. Still, when she fell asleep that night, it was with the taste of him still on her lips and the memory of his hands mapping every inch of her skin. Some risks were worth taking, some secrets worth keeping. At least until the world inevitably intruded and forced them to make choices they weren't ready to face.